So the project I want to do this week involves drawing some leaves and then doing some nice fun doodles and things over the top, doing some little patterns and different designs. And for that I'd use a white pen. But I've been quite often using the Uni Posca pens. They've been my favourites for a while. But I thought it would be good to get some different white pens and test them out, and also to try them against like white paint. So I'm going to do a little test here. I've set up this little page in my sketchbook and I'm going to test all of these different pens and the paint and see which I like the best. I've got the Uni Posca. That's the one I've been quite often using, and it goes really nicely over the top of really dark things, but I've noticed that over the top of light watercolour it sometimes doesn't show terribly well. I've got two Uni-ball pens. These are Signo pens, and there's like a standard one and a broad one. They're going there. And then I've got these jelly roll pens. Now these came in a pack of 3 and there's 3 different sizes. There's a 5, an 8 and a 10. And then I just randomly thought I'd see what other white pens I could find and see whether they're any good, because I've never heard of these. I don't know what they're like. So I've got a Derwent paint pen. Oh yeah, this one is an acrylic pen by Montana. And then this one is a Pitt pen in white, a brush pen. And then I'm going to test 2 different types of paint. So this one is the Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache in permanent white. And this is Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White. Now I have used this before and I do like it, but there are differences between pens and paint, and I'm sure we'll cover those when I get to do the test. So I've just glued into my sketchbook a piece of black paper and I'm going to test the pens out on here. I'm going to test 3 different things. I want to test, can it do a nice fine straight line that's kind of nice and smooth and doesn't have any breaks in it? Is it nice bright and white? I'm going to test drawing patterns, probably little circles, to see what the detail is like and how well it controls. And then I'm going to do a solid area as well, so I'm going to try and see how it copes with that. And then, because I want this to test in the way that I'd probably use it, I've painted some little watercolour leaves on this page, and by each of them I've marked what kind of pen I'm going to test on each one, and I'm going to do some little patterns and drawing on each one and just see how it shows up against the watercolour. These I've done little leaves, and I've done one side in raw umber and I've done the other side in Payne's Grey, just to test them out against different colours. And right, so I'm going to get started with the pens, and I'll talk you through them as I'm going and see how I get on. So this one is the Uni Posca pen, which is an acrylic marker, and this is in white, and this is a 0.7 nib. Now they do 2 different types. Now this one's got it looks like a felt tip nib, but it comes to a nice sharp point, so you can get quite a fine line with it. I'm going to give it a bit of a shake, and just off to the side I've got a little bit of paper that I can scribble on. Just if it gets a bit stuck, I want to kind of give it a fair test. So let's see, how does it do with straight lines? So fairly nice and smooth straight lines. There's no breaks in the lines. I'm going to do some little circles. Now this pen is a little bit scratchy sometimes, and with it being an acrylic pen, sometimes it kind of dries a bit and you've got to kind of pump it to get the ink flowing again. But I'm able to draw quite nice little circles. They're all nice and sharp. There's a few areas where it's a little bit paler, and then I'm just going to do a little solid square at the end. So that's gone on quite nice and smoothly, and you can't really see any lines in it, but it does look fainter. It's more of a grey than a true white. I could maybe see if I can go over it again and do a second layer. Maybe I'll try that. So that's second layer on the right hand side. Yeah, that's a bit brighter and whiter. So the second pen is the Uni-ball Signo, and this is the finer one. And this is a UM120AC, if you need to look it up. And straight lines. So these are quite fine. There are some breaks in the lines, and there are areas where it's thinner and it's kind of yeah, it's gone away and come back. You also get little dots at the end where you lift your pen up, and little circles. Now I think these little circles look brighter than the lines did, and with it being really fine I can get a lot of detail in there and draw some really small ones. So I quite like the way it's done the circles there. It is a lot lighter than the Posca pen, even more so on camera I think. And then let's see what happens when I try and fill in an area with it. It does look a bit more kind of stripy than the Posca. Let's do a little bit more on this side. Yeah, and you can see like the pen lines in there, so it's not nice and white and smooth. So this one again is a Uni-ball Signo, and this one says broad on the tip, on the lid I mean. So I'm going to try this one. So I have got some nice fine lines, and some of them are quite yeah, some of them are quite even, and then some of them have got little breaks in them. But it's looking a lot brighter than the fine lines on the fine nib pen. And little circles. And I quite like some of the circles. There's a few places where it's been a bit scratchy and kind of needs going over again. But mostly it's done a good job. Right, let's try filling in a solid area. And again, it's looking a little bit scratchy. Let's try getting a bit more ink on this area. I might leave this until it's dry and then go over and do it again. And that'll give it a fairer test. But yes, it's looking brighter white. It's actually looking brighter white than the Posca marker, but you can see the pen lines in it. So the Jelly Roll pens. This one is 0.5, and I don't think 0.5 is the width of the nib. I think they're actually smaller than that. So quite faint lines with the occasional little darker bit in it. The little circles are very detailed. Be good for lots of kind of really tiny detail, but it's not showing up terribly well on the black. And then I'm not sure that this is going to do very much trying to fill in an area. It's just really quite fine. This is probably not the pen to use for that. Let's move on and see what the 08 does. And already I can tell that's looks smoother and it's more clear. There are still little darker bits in these lines. Little circles. They're doing quite nicely. I don't think it's as bright white as the Signo pen or the Posca pen. It's looking more grey on this black paper. But it feels quite nice. It feels quite nice and smooth to write with. And that's a solid area there. And then the 10. Again, this feels nice and smooth to write with. Again, there's some darker areas in those lines. So, and again, when I do the circles, it's got some like darker and lighter areas. It's not like a consistent weight. Maybe if I do it really slowly, it'll be deeper. No. And then let's fill in an area. And that's filling in quite nicely. So yeah, again, with it being a gel pen, you're seeing the kind of the trail of the pen, but it's looking a lot brighter and whiter against the black. Now onto these 3 pens that I've not tried before. So this one is the Derwent paint pen, and I've had a little bit of trouble like with this one kind of bubbling. Like it kind of seems to get dried and then you press the nib down to get more ink, but then a whole load comes out. And it feels quite smooth to write with. But what I'm noticing is that initially the ink comes out and it's really bright and white, but then it seems to fade. So it'll be interesting to see what this looks like when it's dry. It feels nice, but I don't think it's going to give me a nice bright white line. Let's fill in the area. And that's a little uneven. But I am able to add more onto the surface and even it out a little bit. This one is the Montana Acrylic, and it comes in different nibs, and this one's the extra fine. And it's a little, so it came out a little wide to start with, and then it's gone a bit scratchy. See if I pump the pen a little bit more and get a bit more ink out. But yeah, again, it feels a bit scratchy to write with and it's not very neat. I'm getting kind of like these double lines. Let's try giving it a bit more of a shake and trying to see if I can get a bit more consistent ink out. There, we've got a bit more. Let's see. And let's try filling in an area. And yeah, it's quite inconsistent. It's not coming out neatly. I'm struggling to get like a nice consistent line with this one. It is nice and bright though, it's nice and white. The last of the pens is the Faber Castell Pitt pen, which is in white, and this one's a brush pen. It's got like a felt tippy nib, but it comes to a nice fine point. It feels nice and smooth to write with. It looks a bit grey. Now with it being a brush pen, I'm not going to get smooth and consistent circles. I'm going to get ones with like thinner and thicker lines. That's what you'd expect with a brush pen. The ink's coming out nice and smoothly, and it does seem to be quite even. It's just not very bright. And it colours in beautifully, just not all that brilliantly. So now for the two paints. This is the Winsor in Gouache, and I've just squeezed a bit out on this plate. And I'm going to be using this brush for both paints to give it a fair comparison. It's a size 2 Stacker mini liner brush. I'll put the details below anyway. So obviously with the brush you've got to have a steadier hand. So that's one disadvantage of it. It's slightly harder to control when you're painting things like little circles or curvy shapes. And then let's paint in a nice flat area of solid colour. And then this is the bleed proof white. So I've got some little areas where it's gone kind of a little bit dry and patchy because I've just mixed a little bit of water in with it. And when that water's run out, you get that kind of dry brush effect. This is allowing me to do finer circles. I think because of the consistency of the paint. So even though I'm using the same brush, I'm getting a bit more detail in there. And then let's paint an area in. Okay, before I give you my final judgment, I'm going to add each of my pens and paints onto its leaf. So I'm going to speed up through that and come back to you at the end and let you know what I think about these different pens and paint options. Okay, so I've done little doodles all over these little leaves, and I think it's really interesting to see how the pens have reacted with the watercolour as compared to the paper. I'd thought that going into it, the Sakura jelly roll in the 10 looks nice and bright on the paper, but on the watercolour it's almost blended in. It's really hard, it looks a bit muddy. It doesn't look nice and bright white. So yeah, I think of the pens, I think for me it's between the Posca, which is this one, and the Signo, which is this one, the third one down. And those two here, so this one's the Posca and this one's the Signo. I'd probably put them as a tie because the Posca I think doesn't look quite as bright. It's not quite as bright and white I think on the watercolour, the Uni-ball is coming out brightest, but I had noticed that there's a few lines where it skipped a little bit. There's a few bits where I had to go over it again, where it sometimes does that double line thing that gel pens quite often do, because it kind of pushes the ink to the side of the path of the pen, so you get like a little tram line. You can see that a little bit. The Posca is nice. It feels a little bit scratchy, but it does lay down colour, and you can layer it. What I noticed with all of the gel pens was that it was really hard to layer the pens, so you couldn't kind of go over it. It just seemed to lift the ink from the previous layer. You can, let's see if I can fix this line. You can go over a line like that and make it stronger. And so because you can do that, I think this one's not a bad pen to use. And I think of all of the pens on the watercolour, this one is the brightest. So brighter even than the Posca marker. So I think this one is going to stand out most when I do watercolour painting and use pen over the top of it. It's just a shame that it skips a little bit. But neither of these will be bad pens. They'll both be good to use. The Jelly Roll pens I was disappointed with. I'd heard a lot about them and I thought they'd be really good. But over the top of the watercolour, that's these three here, they've just kind of blended in. They all look kind of grey and a bit muddy. And the 5, the smallest one, you can hardly see at all. I don't even know if you can see on camera that there's anything on there at all. And the 10, I think on paper they look quite nice. On the black paper I think they work well, but on top of watercolour I wouldn't recommend these at all. This is the Uni-ball Signo with the fine nib, and I'm not particularly happy with how this works on watercolour either. Again, it looks alright on the paper, but over the watercolour it doesn't stand out very well. It's not clear, although it is better than the Jelly Roll pens. And then the other 3 pens, so the Derwent paint pen, so as I put it on, it seemed to fade almost. It seemed to come out nice and bright, like the ink would come out nice and bright out of the pen, and then it faded. So it doesn't look very bright on there, and it doesn't look very bright on the watercolour either. The Faber Castell Pitt pen, I think the Pitt pens are a different type of pen. They're more like a felt tip pen, and so the white ink in here is not terribly opaque. So it's quite transparent, it's quite translucent, and this is it over the leaf, and you can see like it's quite transparent, so you can see the colour of the watercolour underneath it. So if you wanted a subtle effect, it would be okay, and it's really nice to draw with. I think the Pitt pens are probably better in coloured versions. And then this is the Montana acrylic pen, and I normally like an acrylic pen, but this one I just felt was scratchy and I couldn't get a consistent line with it. Oh, it is quite bright. So yeah, it's this one here. I think it is nice and bright, but I don't feel like I get a consistent kind of line with it. So I don't think I'll be using this one. So the 2 paints, the Gouache and the bleed proof white, they're both fed really nicely on the watercolour. They both stand out really nicely. Could use either of these. The bleed proof white, it was easier to get a fine line just because of the consistency of the paint. And this layers quite nicely, and you can get even kind of brighter and stronger whites with it. I like that you can get nice fine details with the brush, although it's always a bit more tricky getting consistent smooth lines with a brush. But yeah, the 2 paints both layer well, so if you've got a bit more of a translucent quality of your paint, you can layer it and make it stronger and bolder. So yeah, so that works nicely. So yeah, I think if I'm going to use a pen, on my watercolour projects. It's close, but I think I'm going to be using this one, the Uni-ball Signo UM153 broad nib. So there we go. So thanks very much for watching. I hope that you found this helpful. I'm going to be doing the autumn leaf project where I'm going to be using this pen, and you'll see that video coming up on Friday. So if you liked this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more from me, then do subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye bye.